Good evening, everyone. By now, you've all been deployed to your base camp PODS throughout the city of Gapville. Right now, I'm going to bring you up to speed of the events of the past day. Watch this television broadcast from yesterday evening and use the briefing notes provided to keep track of the situational details.
Breaking news this afternoon in Gapville. Just over an hour ago, at around 3:50 p.m., a package exploded in the loading bay at the Sort and Send mail delivery warehouse. The explosion was from a dirty bomb, originally intended for this television station, and it has now spread several ounces of radioactive cesium-137 dust into the southern industrial sector of the city. The contaminated areas include the South End LRT station and the International Borders and Customs warehouse. Our provincial hazmat teams are on site and conducting investigations at this moment. By the time authorities determined a radiological presence and alerted the hospital, 6 warehouse workers were taken to the McLaughlin Memorial by ambulance. Also, some explosion victims with mild injuries had co-workers, friends, even taxis transport them to hospital to get treatment for the glass shards and flying debris. These casualties contaminated the hospital's emergency room and some of the patients and healthcare workers who were in the ER at the time. After the 4 p.m. shift change, some contaminated healthcare workers went out in the public, unknowingly spreading radiation carried on their skin and clothing. The contaminated ambulances also went back out on call before they could be notified of their radiation exposure. Some of the workers evacuated from the Sort and Send warehouse also left the premises before being aware of their condition. Tracking is now underway for anyone who was in the area at the time of the explosion. If you have any information or suspect you may have been in contact with a contaminated person or area, please go directly to the emergency treatment center that has been set up in the parking lot of the McLaughlin Memorial Hospital. A public safety and emergency preparedness official is going to join us here to give more information, but now let's go to our reporter, John, on site at the Emergency Operations Center.
Claire, fire, hazmat, and police are all on the scene at the Sort and Send mail delivery warehouse. We are now well away from the actual site. Authorities are currently establishing the hot zone, the areas that have radiation readings above acceptable levels, and we have set up this emergency operations center here in the parking lot of the local mosque. All of the buildings in a 2-kilometer radius of the explosion are currently being evacuated. This includes the massive International Borders and Customs warehouse, as well as the LRT South End station, and 2 high-rises. One is an apartment building, the other an office tower. I also understand that there are police and security officials at the Gapville Domestic Airport. They have just reported elevated readings at the airport that could be related to either naturally occurring radon or from possibly more malicious sources. Police officials at the airport have begun to shut down the terminal. We've also had word that 90 prisoners at the medium security penitentiary who were outside in the exercise yard at the time of the explosion may have been exposed to radiation as well. Correctional services are working with police and hazmat to determine the next course of action for the prisoners, guards, and any visitors who may have been contaminated. Red Cross volunteers have already been getting reception centers and shelters ready, with supplies, blankets, ready-to-eat meals, and water. There is a lot of worry about possible contamination from people's clothing or skin, and some civilian volunteers are wearing rubber gloves and surgical masks. It is important to note that these things do not protect you from radiation. Please do not go to the hot zones for any reason, and only go to assessment centers if you feel you have been exposed. Back to you, Claire.
Thanks, John. And now I welcome Paul Cornell with Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. Paul, can you give us an idea of the next steps forward?
Yes, thanks, Claire. We are currently working with Federal Police, the Security Intelligence Services, and the National CBRN team to clear the contamination, track down all the potential victims of radiation exposure, and evacuate areas to be determined in a hot zone. We've also contacted the Department of Defense, the military, and the National Health Agency. Gapville is going to need help with evacuation shelters, security at the prison, support for healthcare workers, additional scientific support, and decontamination for victims, responders, and property. These federal agencies will be arriving in Gapville within the next few hours. The Transportation Safety Board and Airport Authority are working with Security Intelligence Service right now to evacuate the terminal and are redirecting commercial air traffic to the provincial capital of Primerton. Municipal transit services have also been halted for now until we can track down all the potentially exposed victims and all areas of the city that have unacceptable levels of radiation. Gapville needs to understand that this is an international terrorist incident. We can expect a lot of outside interest over the coming hours and days. I expect we will see the arrival of the international press, NATO, and the UN within the next day or so. Our Security Intelligence Service will be working with the highest level of international governments to find the perpetrators of this horrible attack.
Thank you, Paul. Right now we are going to go to Colleen Davids, who is at the McLaughlin Memorial Hospital in the treatment center set up in the parking lot. Colleen?
Hello, Claire. The latest word from the hospital is that there are 17 wounded. The 6 closest to the explosion are critically ill. Some of the victims of the flying glass and debris show signs of mild to moderate radiation exposure. Apparently, the radiation sickness is worse if the victim has open wounds. There is also a lot of concern around pregnant women and children, as they are the most seriously affected by the long-term effects of radiation. The hospital has called a code brown for hazardous materials. They have closed the emergency room temporarily until they can assess the level of radiation and perform any decontamination that may be required. The hospital has also activated a memorandum of understanding with our local pulp and paper mills, using their chemical protection equipment and self-contained breathing apparatus to give to the frontline healthcare workers and responders. More and more people have been arriving at this emergency center in the past hours, as word of the dirty bomb has spread. The hospital staff is working hard, and the Red Cross has even brought out some volunteers to help. Dealing with the possible radioactive clothing in contaminated homes is a massive job, and I think we are just looking at the tip of the iceberg here. Claire, back to you.
Thank you, Colleen. We are now joined by Louise Kitchener with the Provincial Public Health Office. Louise, can you give us some more information about this radiation exposure and the possible effects? What can people do about it?
Well, the substance used in the attack is called cesium-137. It can be found in some older medical equipment and industrial gauges. This type of radiation stays in the body for almost 5 months in humans and can last over 60 years in objects. Initial readings at the sort and send delivery warehouse show moderate levels of radiation, and because the explosion occurred at the open loading bay doors, there was some exposure outside the area and in adjacent buildings. We need to make sure that everyone evacuates the contaminated areas and does not enter the hot zone for any reason. As you will see in the corner of your screen, the Ministry of Natural Resources has offered real-time aerial mapping of the projected radiation plume. Our cool autumn weather is working against us, as hot days with a high ceiling and steady wind to disperse the particles would be ideal. The contamination outside of the direct area is mild. When breathed in, this level of exposure will give you nausea and headaches after 1 to 2 days of exposure. Moderate exposure reacts a bit faster, within 12 to 24 hours, with more severe nausea and vomiting. Symptoms of moderate exposure can also include fever, hair loss, and bloody vomit. Anyone who came into contact with a contaminated person or area will have received a mild dose of radiation, and although it isn't fatal, it can increase your risks for long-term cancers anywhere from 1 in 5 to 1 in 100. If you feel any symptoms, it is important to get to a healthcare professional or the hospital assessment center right away.
Thanks, Louise.
The federal presence and the military are here following the implementation of the National Emergency Plan, following a request by the province and the municipality this morning. Since that time, national resources have been marshalling and arriving in different groups and waves across the city. Given that this is a terrorist event, security intelligence agencies along with the National Police Force will be taking the lead in the forensic investigation supported by the local police. The local police will be concentrating on public safety and containment of the sites. The military will be assisting them in providing security at the prison on the exterior as well as at the perimeter of various contaminated sites. The military will also be assisting the hazmat teams in doing a city-wide assessment to detect any additional sites, and if discovered, they will provide additional security to prevent people from further exposure. The current taskings for all national groups will be centered on security and providing humanitarian assistance under the direction of the local authorities. Right now, let's look over the last public health press release, which gives us some numbers regarding casualties, and we'll also watch the late-night update from last night.